Okay, so with Lesson 6, we're going to begin a new unit. The first unit of the course focused on poetry and mythology and the epic as some of the oldest forms and genres of literature. In this second unit, we're going to turn our attention to drama, which is also one of the oldest forms of literature, but it reached its height during the Elizabethan era when Shakespeare was writing, who's obviously the most famous dramatist. So that's why we're focusing on it now. But we will look a little bit at the history of drama and how it arose, roughly at the same time as, or just a little bit later, but pretty close to the same time as the epic. So we've talked a little bit about the purpose of different genres, different styles of literary texts. The epic with the epic hero, the purpose there was to have a figure who, while flawed, was also an exemplar of how to behave, how to live in a society. Achilles still followed, or eventually followed, the path the gods laid out for him, despite his pride and his flaws. And pride wasn't considered as negative a trait in Greek times as we would consider it today. And obviously Rama was a virtuous example of how to live your life according to Dharma. Poetry as well. We talked about symbols and images and the ability to convey meaning. With drama, the purpose is to captivate and hold the attention of the audience. We talked about how poetry was read aloud, but it still wasn't quite a show, so to speak, in the way we think of drama. Drama throughout the centuries would be much more of what we would generally think of film as today. The purpose to entertain. If you think of going into a movie theater with the dark lights, and you can leave to go to the restroom or get snacks or whatever, but I would say most people are typically not as inclined to do so as when they're at home and can pause the film. So in a movie theater, that feeling of being completely drawn in and for 2 hours or 2.5 hours or however long you're there, focusing completely on this vehicle that's meant to entertain you, that's very similar to drama. Truly great drama captivates and holds the attention of the audience all the way through and evokes emotions in them. And so this is part of why drama was appealing and why it was popular, dating all the way back to the Greeks, when Sophocles wrote Oedipus and Antigone, which are probably the two most famous Greek plays, and because they're Greek plays, two of the oldest plays we know of. So dating all the way back to then, drama was popular because, again, like poetry, you didn't need to be literate to experience drama. You didn't need to be able to read, you would just go and watch it. And so drama was very captivating, very entertaining, very suspenseful, very emotional, would evoke emotions in the audience, the same way film and television do for us today. In this history of drama we're looking at here, we'll talk a little bit about different types of plays and different features and whatnot. The Greek plays were primarily tragedies. Macbeth, which is our reading for today, is also a tragedy, so we'll talk a little bit about that too. But in the Greek tragedies, they featured a chorus, which was a specific feature unique to the Greeks that, to a certain degree, although not completely, died out in later centuries. And this is a group of individuals who were not main characters in the play, who were not directly involved with the narrative, but would speak almost more to the audience, and kind of almost like a good analogy I would have would be like a commentator during a sports game. If you're watching a football or basketball or baseball game, and the main thing you're watching is the game, that's what you're focusing on, and you can certainly watch it without the volume and draw your own conclusions, but then there's also a commentator that's there to enhance the experience by being an expert, so to speak, in the field and commenting on it. That's similar to the chorus. And so we don't have time to look at Oedipus or Antigone in this class, although they're both beautiful plays. But if you do, you'll notice that chorus there. So with this history of drama, obviously it began in the Greek period with Sophocles and with Oedipus and Antigone, and carried on throughout. I would say it reached its height of popularity during the Elizabethan era, or what they call the Renaissance in British literature, particularly with Shakespeare. Although there were other playwrights at the same time, Johnson and Marlowe and others, who contributed, although not as significantly as Shakespeare, contributed to the popularity of drama. It was very popular during the Elizabethan period, the Tudor period, and then the Stuart period, through the 18th century, really. Very popular in the 18th century, too, although that 17th century into the 16th century, that was really the height, especially in England. Part of the popularity obviously was due to Shakespeare and due to Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, which was a very unique building. It was rebuilt multiple times, and now if you go to London, it's been rebuilt at the end of the 20th century, and you can actually go and see it as kind of a tourist attraction. But it was a very popular place because you could see the plays, and one of the reasons was the pit. The pit was, basically on the ground levels, standing right on the ground, not in seats. And so these were the, not actual seats, but the cheap seats, so to speak, the cheapest tickets, which you could actually get for a penny. Obviously, inflation is involved. This is the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century, but nonetheless, for a penny, you could get in to see the play. And so, the people who were sitting higher up in the actual seats would refer to this area as the pit, and to the people who watched the plays down there as groundlings. But they were essentially the working class. And this is a big deal because the ability of the working class to experience the arts, especially when with literacy rates being so low, for over another 250 years still after this, for the working class to be able to go in and see these plays, that was a pretty big deal. So drama is very appealing for its entertainment value, being able to captivate, hold the attention of the audience, evoke their emotions, and also because it was able to entertain the working classes. They were able to find this material entertaining too. So that was a big facet of its play. Continue on now, we'll talk a little bit about the different types of Elizabethan plays. Comedies were a form that hadn't been around as long as tragedy, and so Shakespeare is probably most famous, especially in academia, for his tragedies, but he wrote almost as many comedies as he did. He probably wrote more comedies than tragedies. And they're very entertaining. They're very, very funny. There's a lot of, dirty jokes that, would go over the heads of probably younger individuals. So you could watch them with a younger audience, but they're very entertaining. The Taming of the Shrew, Measure for Measure, Twelfth Night, Midsummer Night's Dream. One of my personal favorites, Much Ado About Nothing, both the 1990s version with Kenneth Branagh and then the new version directed by Joss Whedon are very good. Much Ado About Nothing is a really funny and entertaining play. Typically, comedy plays always end with marriages. And it's the happy comedies to have a happy ending is what they're known for, and it's almost always 3 marriages, it turns out, in Shakespeare and other Elizabethan dramas. Some playwrights during that period are a little bit different. Ben Jonson, who is one of Shakespeare's closest friends, his comedies typically end with everyone in jail, instead of everyone still married, like his famous play of Volpone. But they're still comedies. Tragedies are the more famous form, although many of Shakespeare's comedies are thoroughly studied. And this is, dates back to the Greeks, as we talked about. The typical difference here is everyone dies in the end. Well, not every single character, but the majority of the main characters do. And we'll talk in a minute about whether that still equates to a happy ending or not. Certainly, compared to a comedy, it's much more tragic, but it's very complex. So we'll talk about that in a minute when we look at Aristotle's theory from the Poetics reading. The final example are history plays. So Shakespeare wrote a lot of these too. Henry V is probably the most famous one, and there's the famous Kenneth Branagh film version from the late 80s, but Henry VIII, Richard II, Antony and Cleopatra. Really interesting plays that are Julius Caesar, obviously, would be another one. That tend much more toward the tragic, but have a deep focus on history and actual historical events and people from history. So these are the three types of plays that Shakespeare primarily wrote and were primarily popular during the Elizabethan period. There are some plays like The Merchant of Venice and The Tempest that are two of Shakespeare's most famous plays that technically would be considered comedies because they end with the marriages at the end and do have some funny parts, but especially The Merchant of Venice verge much more on the area of tragedy, and some of the more recent film versions of those capture those elements really well. After the Elizabethan period, drama was still very popular for the same reasons, and was continued to be popular after the Renaissance. The next kind of literary movement, philosophical movement in Britain is referred to as the Restoration, and then that continues into the 18th century, and you don't really have a new literary movement until Romanticism begins in the very late 18th century, the last 10 or 15 years of the century and into the 19th century. So during that long period between the Renaissance and Romanticism, you have plays that are still very popular but a different style. Restoration plays were known for being satires. Tragedy wasn't really as popular of a form anymore. They were almost all very satirical. The characters and the playwrights both trying to be as witty as possible and outwit the other individual, and so they're very funny, very entertaining plays with some social commentary. I think the current popularity is not as enduring because without the tragic element, I think some critics feel they don't go as deep. And the ones that do, to be able to find that depth, you have to look to the social commentary, which is more difficult to understand when you're not living during that time. But certainly drama at that time was still popular well into the beginning of the 19th century, and what dominated after the types of plays listed above were these 18th century satires. Drama, though, in the mid-19th century does become less popular. Education reforms during the Victorian period led to rise in literacy rates, especially among the middle class. The middle class basically became able to read, and many members of the working class did too. And once they could read, they wanted to read novels. And we'll talk more about this in Lesson 10 when we talk about the rise of the novel. But once the mass population could read, they wanted to read novels, and so going to see a drama, that appeal wore off somewhat. Of course, drama is still around, though. Some other types of drama are closet drama, which I sure was around before, but is mostly known for coming about in the 19th century. I think in part because people weren't going to see. They were still going to see plays quite a bit. It just wasn't the dominant form anymore. Once the novel became the dominant form, I think you can see more of why people would write closet dramas. But a closet drama is a play not written to be performed. So it still has all the elements. If you read a closet drama, the cast of characters and their descriptions at the beginning, the scenes and the acts, and the written in lines the characters speak, but it's the writer's not intending for it to be performed, whereas before almost exclusively plays were written to be performed. The best example probably, or the most popular example of a closet drama is Goethe's Faust, which some of you may be familiar with. So that's a good example. And certainly, though drama is still performed, people were still going to plays all the time, performing plays in the street in the 19th century. It's not that it died out. You just also had, now people could read, and so they would read novels too, especially the working class. In Lesson 10, we'll talk about how novels were popular among the working class. So into the 20th and 21st century, what has happened to drama? Drama now is seen more the way poetry and then I guess what you would call highbrow novels were in earlier centuries. Obviously, if you go to Broadway, go to Times Square, go to Piccadilly Square in London, there's all kinds of plays playing, and they're very popular. But compared to, say, something like the novel, where you have thousands or hundreds of thousands of novels each year that are on best-selling lists, and in every airport, you see people reading novels on the plane. I mean, drama's still definitely around. There's just that distinction. So a lot of times now, rather than being something that's consumed by the masses for entertainment, because in addition to novels, you have television and film that are more consumed by the masses for entertainment, drama now has taken on more of an artsy aspect, and is considered, part of the arts, or the fine arts, that the average media consumer might see as being on a different kind of level than the films or television shows or novels they particularly consume. So a lot of times you have writers who are striving to do things differently, more out of the box, more postmodern types who are looking more to receive good reviews and win awards rather than make a huge profit. Probably a good comparison would be, in the world of literature now, the play is more like the independent movie, and the novel is more like the blockbuster movie in the 21st century would be a good distinction. So, how do we study drama? We've talked about how to study and analyze poetry, looking at the images, seeing what the author's trying to do, trying to convey through that image, makes sense. For every type of literary text we study, we want to have a framework, something to fall back on for how to approach and analyze it. We're going to look at critical theory in Lesson 11, which will give us tools for analyzing all the kinds of literary theory, but just most basically, before getting into those more kind of complex critical theories for each style, what are the basic things you look for? Poetry, you look for images, how the images function. What do you do for drama? Well, you can answer one simple question. Does the play captivate and hold the attention of the audience, and if so, how? Think about, in Shakespeare's time and Greek times, why people were going to plays, to be entertained. If to see a truly great play, what should happen is you should go into the room, sit down, and be completely glued to that stage, your mind not wandering. And this isn't on you as the audience member to pay attention. This is on the actors, the performers, the director, the writing, the script for the play, to be compelling enough to draw in your attention and have it and not leave. If that happens, then you're seeing a truly great drama. So if it does happen or it doesn't, what you can do afterwards is break down and analyze why or why not. Now, certainly, drama adds another element to analysis where you'd be analyzing the performances of the actors, the set pieces, etc. Obviously, in this class, we can't go on a field trip to see a play, although if you have the opportunity to during the course of the class, that'd be great. But so we mainly have the ability to look at the language and analyze the language and think, would this be captivating to us if we were seeing it be performed, to the best of the actor's abilities. So we can't really take acting and set design into consideration, but we should know that that's part of analyzing drama, and keep that in mind for when you do see a live play. Aristotle was the first critic, and I assigned a short section from his volume Poetics. He was the first critic or scholar to present a theory for how to study drama, how to analyze drama. And so Poetics is the oldest theory of how to study drama. And so if you read it, you know that he divides up the elements into drama into 4 or 5 parts. I'm going to go over those now to make sure they're clear, as I also ask you to address them in your discussion board post. The first is tragic stature, and that is there's a protagonist that's appealing. You like this character, you want to root for them, they're sympathetic. Typically the author builds that up by providing stature in 2 ways. They usually have some kind of title. They're typically not a working class character, they're a king or a soldier or some other type of, not just a soldier but a great warrior, some type of figure, that's revered by society. But there's also a moral aspect to their personality. They have to be a good king, not just a king, but a good king, so to speak. And this gives the character both stature through their title and stature through their personality. And so this is intentional. The stature is intentional on the playwright's part to draw you in and make you care about a character. And what, for Aristotle, makes it so appealing to captivate and hold the attention of the audience is that this character you like and you want to root for, that you're sympathetic toward, is going to make a mistake. So the Greek word hamarta is the word used here, and for this, and there's some debate over where the word means miscalculation, but there's some debate over whether it's a flaw or a mistake, and it varies from play to play. Is this character flawed? Are they a flawed individual and they make mistakes for that reason? Or are they essentially still a good character, they just make one mistake because they're human? That's kind of the debate. But either way, whether it's a kind of a one-time mistake or arises out of their flawed character, either way they make some mistake. And that's important because it's this figure with stature who people want to root for makes a mistake, and you get frustrated. You're like, oh, why did they do that? Like when you're watching a film and you're rooting for these characters and they keep making bad choices, that kind of feeling. So that feeling, the stature draws you in, and then seeing that mistake, provoking that reaction, holds your attention. Then there's a peripeteia, hopefully I'm pronouncing these correctly, or reversal is the Greek word. So a reversal of fortune, essentially. This person loses their stature because of a mistake. So character you're rooting for makes a mistake that disappoints you, they felt in that way, and that sends them on a downward spiral. Again, if this is done well by the actors and the director, then you're very drawn into this. You want to see what's going to happen to this figure. Next is the anagnoresis, or recognition, which is where things start to turn in a more positive way. Not necessarily for the character's survival or well-being, but more for their moral character. They start to recognize or identify that they've made a flaw/mistake. They start to finally realize what's going on, what they've done. And so this is an important moment both for the character and the audience. This is a place the audience, if you're drawn in and wants to see the character, get to, and it's also an important turning point in the development of the character, because it can lead to the fifth and final element for Aristotle, which is catharsis. And catharsis in Greek means either purgation, purification, or clarification. So you have all these emotions, so does the character. If the character has made this mistake and has fallen from grace, then they're going to be very upset. They probably had some emotions that led them to make the mistake in the first place. The audience has emotions because they're vested in this character, and they're experiencing anger or fear or grief or the similar emotions to the character. So catharsis purges these emotions. It's kind of the resolution to the play. And this is achieved through the recognition. The recognition is such an important point for the character. It dawns on them what has happened, that gives the reader some catharsis. You've heard the phrase that's very cathartic before. It comes from this idea of Greek drama. So essentially you have a character you're drawn into and that's appealing but is flawed, makes a mistake, recognizes their mistake, and even though the mistake likely causes everyone to die in the play, that recognition kind of brings in this moral element and elevates the character to a point where they recover some of that stature, at least not the title because they've fallen, but at least the moral part of their personality is recovered to a certain extent. And that catharsis is, ideally, if the drama is executed properly, is cathartic for both the character and the audience. And in that way, the play doesn't necessarily have a happy ending because so many characters die, but that catharsis gives it a feeling of closure that is somewhat of a positive feeling. And so, hopefully by seeing this outline, you can see why a play following this format would be successful or not. So, a question to ask going forward is, do Shakespeare's plays have these qualities, or do other plays have these qualities? Do they work? Does a play having these qualities, does that lead to you being captivated, drawn in, and really enjoying the play? And if not, is there something else? Does the play captivate and hold your attention? If not, why? If so, how? And if so, how? Does it use this Aristotelian theory, or is it something else? And that's essentially what I'm asking you to do in the discussion board with Macbeth. So let's turn our attention to Macbeth. This is an interesting play, and we're going to get into why I chose it. It's Shakespeare's shortest tragedy, and it's also his shortest play, aside from A Comedy of Errors, which was his very first play. So even a lot of those comedies that aren't as serious and intense as the tragedies, this is still, excuse me, shorter than many of those. So it's very fast-paced and suspenseful. Or it's supposed to be if it's executed correctly in the performance. Excuse me. So Shakespeare had 4 major tragedies: Macbeth, Hamlet, Othello, and King Lear. Hamlet of those is the longest. It's sometimes the most critically studied because there's so much to dig into there, but a full text performance of Hamlet could take 4.5 hours, which is rather long. So a lot of critics and students and scholars complain that Hamlet kind of drags on with so many soliloquies, whereas comparatively Macbeth is very fast-paced and just gets right to the action and moves right along. And there are certainly soliloquies, which is when a soliloquy is when a character addresses just the audience and not the other characters in the play, and is oftentimes on stage by themselves. And Shakespeare was famous for these, especially for the soliloquies by the tragic heroes in his tragedies. So, even though it's fast-paced, suspenseful, and much shorter than the other tragedies, it's still considered one of those 4 big tragedies: Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, and Othello. All of Shakespeare's plays, or the majority of them, maybe not every single one, but certainly the majority of them, are based on earlier material. Shakespeare's obviously, most would say, the greatest writer in the English language, or the greatest writer in the world. I think Shakespeare is great. I don't know if he's my favorite writer, but he's clearly great for a lot of reasons. But he's certainly kind of the most famous, most well-known writer. One thing people don't know about him necessarily is his work is almost always based on earlier work. And so he's a great example of how the ability of the writer to present the story is almost just as crucial as the story itself to the success and appeal of the work. So, along those lines, Shakespeare is able to he adapts earlier plays, like remakes or reboots would be the comparison today, where he bases his plays on historical material, and because he's such a great writer and knows how to set up characters and build suspense and write great dialogue, the material ends up being much more successful than its earlier iterations. And Macbeth's not based on an earlier play like many of his plays, but it is based on historical figures. So a text called Holinshed's Chronicles chronicled kind of the history of the monarchy in Scotland, and you do have an excerpt from it in the cultural context section of your Bedford text. And Macbeth, Duncan, Macbeth, and Macduff were all actual kings in Scotland, and they did follow in that order. Malcolm would be the next king, but Macduff is also an actual person from Scottish history. So there are more characters in the 3 listed here that are based on real people. And Macbeth did kill Duncan to become king, and Macbeth himself was killed, although the circumstances they don't know about. So, the basic elements are the same, but it's very loosely based. Shakespeare takes kind of this brief part of Scottish history and runs with it in the play. But it is, good, I think, to have that background in the back of your mind. So with the background established on Macbeth, let's consider Aristotle's theory we just went over in relation to Macbeth. Stature. I think Macbeth definitely has stature. At the beginning, characters, you don't see Macbeth until the 3rd scene or so, because first you have the witches, and then you have Duncan and some of his things talking about what has happened, and they're talking up Macbeth here. These early scenes are devoted to building up Macbeth's stature. He's done well in battle. He's fought for his king. He's initially loyal to his king, and because he's done well, Duncan awards him the Thane. He becomes the Thane of Cawdor. So He definitely has stature. He's not a king, but he has a title and he's respected by his peers. So there's definitely some work done by Shakespeare devoted to building up his stature in the beginning. I think we can certainly say Macbeth is a flawed character. The play is most known for the blind ambition of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and ambition is clearly the most central theme, and ambition is certainly a character trait that many would deem, well, being ambitious isn't necessarily a flaw, but the blind kind of ambition without any regard for what one is doing that Macbeth displays here, I think people would agree is certainly a flaw. And the mistake would be pretty obvious, the choice to kill Duncan. There are plenty of other mistakes throughout, but I don't think anyone would say it's all right that he killed Duncan, but killing Banquo or killing Macduff's family, that's the real mistake. He could have gotten by with killing Duncan. I don't think anyone would say that. Clearly, even though it happens close to the very beginning, the choice to kill Duncan is what leads to Macbeth's fall. He certainly experiences a fall. He dies at the end of the hands of Macduff. He's very paranoid, and I would argue almost goes insane or goes insane before then, and knows that even though he takes the throne from Duncan after he dies and becomes King of Scotland for a brief period, even though that happens, it's still he's still falling during that time because he's paranoid the whole time he's king. He's having to kill more people, kill his friends and their families, and so this is not a good moment for him. The real question here is recognition and catharsis. So in your discussion board posts, I've asked you to say, does Macbeth follow the Aristotelian framework for a successful drama? If so, in what ways? If not, in what ways does it deviate? And if so, does that make it successful? Would it captivate and hold your attention? And if not, would it captivate and hold your attention for a different reason, and why? And so you can certainly cover what we've already mentioned with stature, flaw/mistake, and reversal. But I think recognition and catharsis are going to be the meat of the question that I really want you to look for. Because I think these two are much more debatable than the first three. Does Macbeth recognize at any point that he's made a mistake? Or does he simply go insane, fearing that his mistake will be discovered and that he'll lose the throne? If there's no recognition, is there catharsis? Is Macbeth simply a villain? Typically what you have in Shakespearean tragedies is a hero who's the tragic figure that experiences the reversal and the recognition and catharsis, and then a villain that typically is part of the reason why they make a mistake in the first place, that intervenes, interferes, causes them, disrupts the natural order of things, and leads to the mistake partly, and defeating the villain in part leads to the recognition and catharsis. Macbeth is unique in that the hero is the villain. I think at the end we're rooting for Macduff. He's a very sympathetic character after he loses his family, but Macduff is not, he's a heroic character, but he's not the hero. He's not the character we followed from. He's not the protagonist, I guess. He's a hero, but not a protagonist. He's not So of the characters we follow and root for in Macbeth to succeed in their goals, those characters aren't really a protagonist we follow the whole way through, and the only characters we do, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, are really villains. So the hero is the villain, which makes recognition and catharsis much more difficult to see and understand, which I think is what makes the play complicated and interesting, and why I chose it for our lesson on drama and our look at Shakespeare. So debating that in the discussion board is kind of the goal of the question. Is there recognition and catharsis? If so, how? Which would be a very interesting claim, and you'd have to really defend. And if not, is the play still compelling? If so, how? If what you're given is mainly a villain to follow throughout the course of the play, does that make it entertaining? How and why? So, before we conclude, let's talk a little bit about the power of fear, since that's our theme for the class. a fun discussion often to have with plays is what would they be like if they were adapted into a film, since they were originally performed and mainly existed to be performed. You can ask that question much more clearly and directly than of a novel. So if you were making a film version of Macbeth, who would you cast? Who would be the director? What would it look like? I've thought a lot about this, and because the hero is the villain, an interesting comment I heard from someone in a class before was that they would have Tim Burton direct Macbeth, because they saw it as a horror movie. It's short, it's suspenseful, and the hero is the villain, so why not make it like a horror movie, which, of the different film versions out there, I think a lot of filmmakers try to make it more like a traditional Shakespearean tragedy with, a tragic hero that you want to root for rather than a villain as the main character. And that's an important distinction. So I'm really curious in the discussion board to see where you stand on that. The play is also rumored to be cursed. Because it has all these supernatural, spooky elements, the hero is the villain, etc. I've just heard from actors I know who are in plays that some actors think the play is cursed, and even though it's one of Shakespeare's 4 big tragedies, don't want to put it on for those reasons. I guess you could say it's less canonical in this sense. It's certainly one of the 4 biggest tragedies, but of the 4 big Shakespearean tragedies, it's probably the least studied and the least performed, although still thoroughly studied and still performed all the time. But it is kind of this freaky, little bit different play, which is, again, part of why I chose it. So in terms of the theme of the class, the power of fear, what are the terrifying elements? Once you identify these elements, think about what fears might Shakespeare be trying to evoke. There's certainly witches in the supernatural, and those are terrifying images, so what would those be trying to evoke? Maybe fear of the unknown, fear of the other. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth commit treason, and so some of the cultural context we'll look at in the next lesson have to do with treason, but this was certainly a legitimate fear for the English monarchy, if not the English citizens at the time, throughout all of Great Britain. So the choices these characters make may certainly be they're intended to evoke the fear of treason. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are also terrifying figures themselves. Macbeth kind of represents that loyal figure that seems like, at the beginning, this is like a great guy. That's part of the dramatic appeal of the play. Is this, in those first couple scenes, this seems like a great guy, right? And then he hears this prophecy from these witches, and all of a sudden it all goes downhill. So Macbeth kind of represents that fear of a person who seems very reliable, a reliable subject, a reliable soldier, all of a sudden turns and kills his king, the person he's loyal to. I mean, that's a deep fear. Lady Macbeth is interesting because she's very, it's very debated, her involvement here. People have lost at different stands, so that's also something I'm curious to see what you have to think. And she certainly goes mad and insane as Macbeth does because of the guilt and because of the paranoia. And going back to what we talked about with Grendel's mother in these kind of, although Shakespeare included women much more and portrayed very powerful women, in general these kind of male-dominated patriarchal worlds, the feminine form being other, unknown, or terrifying, in what way does Lady Macbeth kind of embody some of the same themes as Grendel's mother? I think is an interesting question to think about. These aren't necessarily questions for you to answer in the discussion board, because that I'm asking you to look at Aristotle's theory. They can certainly all play into that if you want to mention things about them, but they're more so meant to just be thought-provoking. I'd like to have kind of a discussion with you as we go through the lessons, even though this is an online class. So these are questions to think about and kind of answer in your head as we go through the lessons, and lessons will get more geared around questions like this as we're getting further in the semester and doing less background and context and looking more at these longer literary texts themselves like Macbeth and Dracula. Our last look here before we move on is going to be the themes present in Macbeth, to give you a real well-rounded discussion of the play. So blind ambition is certainly the central theme because it leads to Duncan's death and is clearly Macbeth's tragic flaw. And again, I say blind ambition. Ambition in general is not necessarily a flawed trait, but certainly the kind of blind ambition that would lead someone to kill someone would be seen as a flaw. So that's the central theme. But there are many other themes. Paranoia and descent into madness we've mentioned. One of the most interesting things, I think, is to kind of watch what happens to Macbeth and Lady Macbeth after Duncan's murder as the play goes on before the conclusion. They certainly experience their actions are avenged. Macduff gets his revenge, but is it even necessary? Is the guilt, is what happens to Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, is that vengeance enough for what they've done? Because they certainly, have a hard time living with this. And does that make them really good people despite what they've done? So that can certainly play into questions of recognition and catharsis for your post. Murder upon murder and lie upon lie is what leads to this. Macbeth's willing to kill Duncan, but then he's the act of killing Duncan puts him into a position where he also has to kill Banquo, who's one of his closest friend, and then also he kills Macduff's family, which involves them, or he sends people to kill these people. So that's, then the murder of women and children. So if you're following the narrative of the play, the acts Macbeth commits get worse and worse and worse, because he kills his king, which is disloyal, but we're maybe not as invested in Duncan as a character as we are Banquo or Macduff. So once you see, he then has to kill a close friend, the guy he's walking with, the first scene you see him with, and then he has to kill another friend and comrade, but also, well, he doesn't kill him, he tries to, and it ends up being his family that's killed. I mean, these are huge steps that take Macbeth to a point that maybe he wasn't willing to go in the first place, but he's into a quagmire. Once he kills Duncan, he can't proceed with his plan without killing these other people, and killing these other people pushed him in his morality to an extent that breaks him and leads to paranoia and madness. And so you almost think of it as someone telling a lie. Almost like if you've seen, there's that Adam Sandler movie, Just Go With It, where he tells one lie, and to maintain the charade he has to keep telling more lies, and it becomes too much. It's kind of the same thing in Macbeth, except with murders, and that would obviously drive anyone insane. So again, these are some interesting things to think about. The supernatural and witchcraft is a big element here. A lot of Shakespeare plays have supernatural elements, but the witches are unique to Macbeth, and a lot of, you probably think of the Salem witch trials in the U.S., but there were witch trials all throughout Europe before and after Shakespeare's time, so he's drawing on some things. We'll see this in the cultural context that were certainly around and are adds kind of an interesting element. So what kind of secondary world does Shakespeare build? I've seen different takes on this and different versions of the play. I've seen even ones where the witches have technology. So if Shakespeare's building a secondary world and he's including witchcraft, what else is he willing to include in it here? How would you characterize this secondary world going back to Tolkien? What are the qualities, the properties, the laws, the physical and moral laws that govern it? Prophecy is a big part here. I mean, this goes hand in hand with the witchcraft, but it's not necessarily in every play. So questions of fate versus free will, going back to the Iliad and Achilles, are here too, because the witches tell Macbeth that no one of woman born shall harm him, and that Dunsinane, the hall he takes over as king after he kills Duncan, will be safe until great Birnam Wood comes there. Of course, the army led by Macduff that's attacking at the end uses the wood, covers themselves in the trees and the leaves and the wood to sneak toward the hall and have a stealth approach, and so great Birnam Wood does come to Dunsinane Hall. In Macduff, before he kills Macbeth, tells him that when he was born he had to be cut out of his mother. A section essentially in the 16th century is what this means. So, that's when the play was written, but it takes place much earlier than that. So there's some irony involved here in that the prophecies are true, but the prophecies make Macbeth think that he's invincible, and the irony is he's actually not. So again, irony is not a coincidence. Irony is where one situation is presented and the opposite is actually what's true. So the prophecies lead Macbeth to think he's invincible. He's actually not invincible. So how does this play into it? In Othello's is the hero and Iago is the villain, and his downfall is perpetuated by Iago, which makes those distinctions clear. The distinctions aren't as clear here. Macbeth is the hero and the villain, but are the witches the villains? Are they the villains because they lead Macbeth down this path? That's an important question to think about in terms of recognition and catharsis. Finally, Lady Macbeth is one of the most interesting figures in the play, if not in all of drama. There's different ways to look at her. She's certainly guilt-ridden and has paranoia like Macbeth. A lot of critics want to see her as this manipulative, horrible force that's worse than Macbeth, that drives him and pushes him to do this. I think there's evidence in the text to support that, but I don't necessarily know if that's my opinion. This is something I never made up my mind about. So again, I'm curious to see what you think as you ponder this question. To what extent is she responsible? Who is maybe more responsible, her or Macbeth? And then especially with regard to recognition and catharsis, after the murders happened, their reactions to it, who is the more sympathetic character? Who is more guilt-ridden? Who do you have more kind of respect and sympathy for, even though they're both villains? And so Lady Macbeth is a powerful female figure in a text at a time when the world was very patriarchal, and a really interesting character. And other issues and themes of doctors and medicine and, of course, she's sleepwalking come into play when we look at Lady Macbeth. Okay, finally, to end the lesson, I have some trailers for you to different film versions of Macbeth. There's one that is actually coming out soon. I don't know if it's out yet, with one of my favorite actors named Michael Fassbender, so I'll be really interesting to see that. I haven't seen it yet. There's also a version that's not very good with Sam Worthington from the mid-2000s that's set in the modern day and I believe in Australia, with kind of some of the gangs there taking the place of the Thanes and Macbeth, and it's an interesting take, but it's not very well done in my opinion, but it is interesting. And there's also the two older versions. There's one that's very famous from the 70s by Roman Polanski, who's more of kind of a horror director, and so that's very interesting to see how he approaches it. And then there's the more kind of traditional one with Orson Welles. So those trailers are there for you to watch with these links, and some questions I think just for your own edification that are really interesting to think about is, which of these trailers do you think follows the play most closely? How did you envision the characters when you were reading it? Do these actors you see in these trailers, or if you watch the films, do they hold up? Or they what you think the characters would look like and act like? What tone should the movie have? Is it a tragedy of kind of the epic proportions of Hamlet or Oedipus, or is it more of just a horror film and almost a slasher film where Macbeth is just going around killing these people or having these people killed? And if so, is it entertaining that way? Is it something else? Is it something other than tragedy or horror? This is probably the most of Shakespeare's tragedies, the plays out of his that are classified as tragedies. This is the one that's probably most open to debate of what genre it really belongs in. And finally, who would you cast in a film? What would your film version look like? Would it be a tragedy? Would it be a horror? What actors would you have? What director would you get? So again, these are just interesting questions to chew on. I always like when I read a text, especially a long one, seeing the film or seeing the trailer and seeing kind of, we talked about every translation is an interpretation, every film adaptation is an interpretation, and so I like seeing someone else's interpretation to kind of help me rethink, challenge my own, and think it through more. So hopefully you enjoy these and enjoyed the play, and I look forward to reading your discussion board post on it.